Gulf of Tonkin, June 17, 1965, 10:30 hours local time, and Commander Lewis Page sat in the front seat of his United States Navy F-4B Phantom II. Call sign from Fighter Squadron 21 aboard the aircraft carrier USS Midway, watching his radar intercept officer Lieutenant J.C. Smith work the scopes as they pushed feet dry 40 miles south of Hanoi, completely unaware that in the next 8 minutes they would score the first confirmed American MiG kill of the Vietnam War, with an AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missile, and that the same weapon system promising 70% kill probability in testing would ultimately achieve only 9.2% effectiveness across 612 shots fired, forcing the United States Navy to completely rebuild how it trained fighter pilots and changing aerial warfare doctrine for the next 50 years. The mission brief that morning had been straightforward enough: escort the Alpha Strike package into North Vietnamese airspace and prevent enemy fighters from interfering with the bombing runs. Standard combat air patrol work that Fighter Squadron 21 had been flying since deploying to Yankee Station in March, but Commander Page and his wingman Lieutenant Dave Batson with his radar intercept officer Lieutenant Commander Rob Doremus had spent weeks during the Pacific transit working through a tactical problem that nobody else seemed willing to address, which was how exactly you were supposed to use a beyond visual range missile system when the rules of engagement required visual identification of the target before you could fire. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II represented the cutting edge of American fighter technology in 1965. A massive twin-engine interceptor weighing 30,000 pounds empty and capable of speeds exceeding Mach 2.2, carrying 4 AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missiles in recesses under the fuselage and 4 AIM-9 Sidewinder heat-seeking missiles on wing pylons, with enough thrust from its twin General Electric J-79 turbojet engines to climb at 41,000 feet per minute and reach altitudes above 60,000 feet. But the aircraft had been designed as a fleet defense interceptor meant to destroy Soviet bombers at long range before they could launch anti-ship missiles at the carrier battle group, not to dogfight nimble enemy fighters in restricted airspace over hostile territory where one mistake meant ejection over the jungle and years in a North Vietnamese prison camp. The tactical innovation that Commander Page and Lieutenant Smith had developed during those long planning sessions was elegant in its simplicity. The aircraft with first radar contact would become tactical lead regardless of who was supposed to be leading the formation. Then the wingman would slide into a 3 to 4 mile trail position behind the leader, and at the merge when the fighters came together the lead aircraft would visually identify the target using a head-on approach that exploited the F-4 Phantom II's superior speed and powerful thrust. Then immediately disengage in the vertical using full afterburner while calling out the identification, allowing the trailing wingman to launch an AIM-7 Sparrow missile at the now confirmed hostile target from a position where the radar-guided weapon would have optimal tracking geometry and time to arm before impact. Lieutenant Smith's radar scope lit up with contacts at 28 miles, 2 bogies inbound fast from the northwest, and he immediately called out the bearing and range while Commander Page pushed the twin J-79 engines to full military power, feeling 16,000 pounds of thrust from each engine pressing him back into the ejection seat as the F-4 Phantom II accelerated through 400 knots, then 500, the big fighter eating up distance as they drove toward the intercept point while Lieutenant Batson and Lieutenant Commander Doremus slid into trail position 3.5 miles behind their leader's aircraft. At 12 miles Commander Page picked up the visual, 2 silver aircraft with distinctive swept wings approaching head-on at their altitude, and in that split second he confirmed what every American pilot had been briefing for months: MiG-17 Fresco Day fighters from the Vietnamese People's Air Force, and he immediately transmitted the identification call while pulling the stick back and lighting both afterburners, the twin General Electric J-79 engines roaring to 17,900 pounds of thrust each as the F-4 Phantom II pitched vertical and climbed away from the engagement, leaving Lieutenant Batson and Lieutenant Commander Doremus perfectly positioned 3 miles behind the now confirmed hostile MiG-17s with a valid firing solution on their radar. Lieutenant Commander Doremus worked his radar scope with the practiced precision of hundreds of hours in the F-4 Phantom II, calling steering corrections to Lieutenant Batson as they refined their geometry on the lead MiG-17 Fresco, and when the range clicked down to optimal launch parameters Doremus gave the authorization and Batson pressed the firing button, releasing one AIM-7 Sparrow missile from the fuselage recess, the weapon dropping clear for a split second before its rocket motor ignited and sent it accelerating toward the target at Mach 3.5, guided by semi-active radar homing that tracked the radar energy being reflected off the MiG-17 by the F-4 Phantom II's onboard system. The Sparrow flew true through 6 miles of Vietnamese airspace, its 9-inch diameter body carrying an 88-pound continuous rod warhead designed to shred aircraft structures on proximity detonation, and at 4,000 feet the radar proximity fuse detected the MiG-17's presence and fired the shaped charge, sending steel rods expanding outward at thousands of feet per second to slice through the enemy fighter's thin aluminum skin and fuel tanks, causing an immediate explosion that blew the North Vietnamese aircraft into flaming pieces that tumbled toward the jungle below. Commander Page and Lieutenant Smith had already repositioned by this time, and they achieved radar lock on the second MiG-17 Fresco, allowing Page to fire his own AIM-7 Sparrow missile that tracked and destroyed the wingman in a second fireball. And just like that, Fighter Squadron 21 from the USS Midway had scored the first 2 confirmed American MiG kills of the Vietnam War, validating years of training and billions of dollars invested in beyond visual range missile technology. Except that what happened over the next 7 years would prove that this engagement on June 17, 1965 was the exception rather than the rule, and the numbers that emerged from operational combat would shatter every assumption the United States military held about modern aerial warfare. The AIM-7 Sparrow missile had entered United States Navy service in 1958 as the AIM-9 Sparrow III, representing a quantum leap forward from earlier beam-riding weapons that required the launching aircraft to maintain perfect bore sight on the target throughout the missile's flight, with the new semi-active radar homing system allowing the F-4 Phantom II to engage maneuvering targets well off bore sight as long as the designating aircraft's radar could maintain lock during the intercept. Testing and evaluation at the Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River, Maryland had produced impressive results, with controlled conditions yielding hit probabilities above 70% and some test series achieving 80 to 90% success rates, leading operational planners to predict that the AIM-7 Sparrow would maintain a 71% kill probability in actual combat employment, transforming air-to-air warfare by allowing American fighters to destroy enemy aircraft from ranges exceeding 10 miles before the adversary could even detect the attacking jet, much less mount any kind of defensive response or counterattack. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II had been specifically designed around this beyond visual range intercept concept, with its massive and APQ-72 radar in the nose capable of detecting fighter-sized targets at ranges exceeding 30 miles and tracking multiple contacts simultaneously, while the tandem crew configuration placed a dedicated radar intercept officer in the back seat to manage the complex sensor suite and weapon system, freeing the pilot in the front seat to focus on flying the aircraft and maintaining optimal tactical positioning throughout the engagement. What nobody fully appreciated during those optimistic planning sessions in the early 1960s was how dramatically the operational environment in Southeast Asia would degrade every assumption built into the testing protocols, starting with the tropical climate that wreaked havoc on the Sparrow's sensitive electronics and extending through maintenance procedures that left missiles sitting on aircraft pylons for weeks without the detailed servicing that the weapon required after every carrier catapult launch and arrested landing, combined with rules of engagement that prohibited firing at radar contacts until visual identification had been achieved, effectively negating the entire beyond visual range advantage that justified the weapon system's existence in the first place. The harsh reality emerged gradually as more Fighter Squadron 21 crews and other units from the USS Midway, USS Constellation, and USS Enterprise engaged North Vietnamese fighters throughout 1965 and into 1966, with after-action reports documenting AIM-7 Sparrow missiles that failed to launch despite proper aircraft alignment and lock-on, or dropped off the rails and tumbled into the jungle without their rocket motors ever igniting, or flew straight for a few seconds before veering wildly off course as if the guidance system had suffered catastrophic failure mid-flight, or tracked perfectly to the target only to pass within lethal proximity without the fuse detonating the warhead, leaving frustrated American aircrews watching enemy MiG-17 Frescos and MiG-21 fishbeds continue flying as if nothing had happened while precious seconds ticked away and the geometry for a second shot deteriorated beyond recovery. United States Air Force crews flying the F-4C Phantom II from bases in Thailand experienced identical frustrations, with the added complication that early USAF variants carried the AIM-4 Falcon missile alongside the AIM-7 Sparrow, and the Falcon proved even less reliable than the already problematic Sparrow, achieving only a 9.2% kill probability that matched the Sparrow's dismal performance, while pilots complained that even when they achieved perfect intercept geometry and followed every step of the employment checklist, the weapons simply refused to work as advertised. Lieutenant Carl Eshman, an F-4 Phantom II maintenance officer at Korat Royal Thai Air Base in Thailand, observed crews bringing aircraft back from missions and shaking their heads in frustration because their AIM-7 Sparrow missiles had checked out perfectly on the ground-based calibration test stands before launch, showing no apparent reason for the failures that occurred when pilots tried to employ them against actual targets in actual combat conditions, and Eshman traced much of the problem to transportation and handling procedures that treated the sensitive guided missiles like dumb bombs, allowing them to be bounced and jarred during loading operations without recognizing that the delicate electronics inside required gentle handling and constant recalibration to maintain proper function. The Vietnamese People's Air Force began the war in a position of desperate disadvantage, with only 36 MiG-17 Fresco Day fighters and approximately 36 qualified pilots when the first aircraft arrived in February 1964, stationed initially across the border in southern China while North Vietnamese airmen completed their training under Soviet and Chinese instructors who taught them to fly the subsonic swept-wing fighter that the Soviet Air Force already considered obsolete by the mid-1960s. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-17 represented an evolutionary development of the earlier MiG-15 that had shocked American pilots during the Korean War, featuring a revised wing with 49 degrees of sweep on the inboard section and 45.5 degrees on the outboard panels, creating the distinctive scimitar planform that gave the fighter its characteristic appearance, while the fuselage stretched approximately 1 meter longer than the MiG-15 to house the same Klimov VK-1 turbojet engine producing 6,500 pounds of thrust, or 7,500 pounds with the afterburner engaged on the MiG-17F variant that formed the backbone of North Vietnamese fighter strength. The aircraft weighed 8,665 pounds empty and could reach a maximum takeoff weight of 13,395 pounds with full internal fuel and external stores, giving it a wing loading of approximately 268 kilograms per square meter compared to the F-4 Phantom II's 383 kilograms per square meter, and that difference in wing loading translated directly into turning performance, with the lighter MiG-17 Fresco capable of achieving tighter radius turns at speeds below 500 miles per hour, especially at altitudes below 5,000 feet where the denser air provided more lift and the lighter airframe could exploit its superior instantaneous turn rate and initial roll response. The first combat employment of the MiG-17 Fresco came on April 3, 1965, when a pair of Vietnamese People's Air Force fighters from the 921st Fighter Regiment attacked United States Navy F-8 Crusader fighter bombers south of Hanoi, raking the American jets with 23mm and 37mm cannon fire from the MiG-17's nose-mounted armament of 2 NR-23 cannons with 80 rounds per gun and 1 NR-37 with 40 rounds. And although North Vietnamese pilots claimed 2 Crusaders destroyed that day, United States Navy records show that all 4 F-80 aircraft returned to their carrier with 1 badly damaged and forced to land at Da Nang Air Base in South Vietnam, instead of risking a damaged arrested landing aboard the ship. The engagement marked a significant milestone regardless of the actual results, because it demonstrated that North Vietnam possessed both the capability and the willingness to contest American air superiority over the North, forcing the United States to divert strike aircraft to combat air patrol duties and complicating every mission with the knowledge that enemy fighters could appear at any moment to disrupt carefully planned bombing runs against bridges, railroads, and petroleum storage facilities throughout the Red River Delta region. The real shock came the next day, April 4, 1965, when MiG-17 Frescos from the 921st Fighter Regiment shot down 2 Republic F-105 Thunderchief fighter bombers attacking the Tan Hoa Bridge, with the American fighters loaded down with 750-pound bombs and unable to maneuver effectively when the North Vietnamese jets came screaming in from above at high speed, and United States Air Force Chief of Staff General John P. McDonnell was reportedly hopping mad to hear that 2 Mach 2 Class F-105 Thunderchiefs had been shot down by Korean War-era subsonic MiG-17 Frescos that the Soviet Union had retired from frontline service years earlier. Ground-controlled intercept became the Vietnamese People's Air Force's primary tactical advantage, with Soviet-supplied radar stations tracking American formations from the moment they crossed the coast and entered North Vietnamese airspace, allowing controllers to vector MiG-17 Frescos and later MiG-21 fishbeds into ambush positions where they could attack from advantageous angles before the American fighters even knew enemy aircraft were in the area, then disengage rapidly and return to their bases before the United States jets could pursue and achieve firing solutions with their temperamental missiles. The North Vietnamese developed what they called guerrilla warfare in the air, refusing to engage in sustained dogfights where American numerical superiority and better trained pilots would eventually prevail, instead striking fast from multiple directions to force bomber formations to jettison their ordnance prematurely, then disappearing back into the defended airspace around Hanoi where surface-to-air missile sites and concentrated anti-aircraft artillery created what American pilots called the most dangerous airspace in the history of aerial warfare. December 1966 saw the effectiveness of these tactics reach a peak when MiG-21 fishbed pilots from the 921st Fighter Regiment shot down 14 F-105 Thunderchiefs without suffering a single loss, exploiting their ground-controlled intercept advantage combined with the F-105's poor turning performance when loaded with bombs to achieve kill ratios that shocked American commanders and forced a complete reassessment of tactics and training throughout the theater. Colonel Robin Olds took command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand during 1966, and he immediately recognized that the Vietnamese People's Air Force's hit-and-run tactics were exploiting fundamental weaknesses in American fighter employment, specifically the predictable routing of strike packages and the lack of dedicated fighter sweeps designed to lure enemy aircraft into sustained engagements where superior American training and aircraft performance could be brought to bear. Olds assembled a planning team including Captain John B. Stone, the wing tactics officer, First Lieutenant Joseph Hicks, First Lieutenant Ralph F. Wetterhahn, and Major James D. Covington, and together they developed Operation BOLO, a deception plan that would make F-4 Phantom II fighters look exactly like bomb-laden F-105 Thunderchiefs on North Vietnamese radar scopes by matching the speeds, altitudes, routes, and electronic signatures that the F-105s normally use during strike missions, with the critical difference being that the Phantoms would be loaded exclusively with air-to-air missiles and flown by the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing's most experienced fighter pilots, creating a trap that would catch MiG-21 fishbeds expecting easy targets and instead finding themselves in a swirling dogfight against determined opponents who had trained specifically for this type of engagement. The operation launched on January 2, 1967 with 7 flights of F-4C Phantom IIs from Ubon plus 7 more flights from the 366th Tactical Fighter Wing at Da Nang Air Base. And the trap worked perfectly when North Vietnamese controllers vectored MiG-21 fishbeds to intercept what they thought were vulnerable F-105 strike packages, only to have Colonel Olds and his wingmen engage with AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles in a 12-minute air battle that destroyed 7 MiG-21s without American losses, temporarily breaking the back of North Vietnamese fighter operations and proving that when American pilots could force sustained engagements on their terms, the technological and training advantages of the United States Air Force and Navy would prevail decisively. The problem remained that Operation BOLO represented the exception rather than the standard operating procedure, because the United States simply didn't have enough fighters available to conduct daily fighter sweeps while also protecting strike packages and maintaining combat air patrols over the expanding area of operations throughout Southeast Asia, and even when American F-4 Phantom IIs achieved favorable intercept geometry and proper radar lock against MiG-17 Frescos or MiG-21 fishbeds. The persistent reliability problems with the AIM-7 Sparrow missile meant that achieving a kill required multiple shots with no guarantee that any of them would actually work, burning through expensive guided missiles at an alarming rate while Vietnamese People's Air Force pilots learned to exploit the weapon's minimum range limitations by forcing close and turning fights where the MiG-17 Fresco's superior low-speed maneuverability gave them a decisive advantage. Captain Richard S. Ritchie, who would later become the first United States Air Force ace of the Vietnam War, recalled multiple engagements where he achieved perfect radar lock on MiG-21 targets only to watch his AIM-7 Sparrow missiles fail to guide, drop off the rails without igniting, or fly straight past the target without the proximity fuse detonating the warhead, forcing him to maneuver for follow-up shots while burning fuel and losing tactical position, sometimes having to disengage, entirely because he had exhausted his missile loadout without achieving a single kill despite doing everything correctly according to the employment checklist. Admiral Thomas Moorer, Chief of Naval Operations, grew increasingly concerned about the poor performance of United States Navy fighters over North Vietnam during the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign that ran from March 1965 through November 1968, with kill ratios showing that American pilots were downing barely 2 North Vietnamese aircraft for each F-4 Phantom II or F-8 Crusader lost in air combat, a catastrophic decline from the 14-to-1 ratio achieved during World War II and the 12-to-1 ratio maintained during the Korean War despite facing experienced Soviet-trained adversaries flying capable MiG-15 fighters. Admiral Moorer directed Captain Frank Ault to conduct a comprehensive study examining every aspect of air-to-air missile performance, from industrial production quality control through fleet maintenance procedures, and all the way to cockpit employment by operational aircrews, and Captain Ault assembled a team of 5 experts who spent from July through November 1968 conducting the most thorough investigation of aerial warfare effectiveness ever attempted, producing a 480-page report officially titled Air-to-Air Missile System Capability Review, but universally known as the Ault Report after its lead investigator. The report's findings proved devastating to prevailing assumptions about modern air combat, documenting that AIM-7 Sparrow missiles were achieving approximately 1 kill for every 10 firing attempts in actual combat employment, meaning a 9 to 10% kill probability compared to the 71% that operational planners had predicted and the 80 to 90% that test series had demonstrated under controlled conditions, and the gap between expectation and reality forced the Ault team to examine every link in the chain from factory production through shipboard storage and into actual combat employment to determine where the system was breaking down. The Ault report identified quality control problems at the Raytheon manufacturing plants producing AIM-7 Sparrow missiles, maintenance deficiencies aboard aircraft carriers where the weapons sat exposed to salt air and tropical humidity without the constant attention they required to remain functional, inadequate test equipment that couldn't properly evaluate whether a missile was actually ready for combat employment or needed to be pulled for depot-level maintenance, and most critically a complete breakdown in training that left aircrews unfamiliar with the dynamically changing launch acceptability envelopes that defined when an AIM-7 Sparrow could be expected to achieve a kill versus when the shot would almost certainly miss despite perfect pilot technique. Captain Ault documented cases where pilots fired Sparrows well outside the weapon's effective range because they didn't understand that the missile's kinematic performance varied dramatically based on altitude, airspeed, target aspect angle, and atmospheric conditions, while other engagements saw pilots refuse to take valid shots because they had lost confidence in the weapon system after experiencing so many failures that they assumed every Sparrow would miss regardless of geometry, creating a psychological barrier that prevented aggressive employment even when conditions favored success. The report's most significant recommendation called for establishing an advanced fighter weapons school that would consolidate fighter doctrine, disseminate lessons learned from combat operations, train a cadre of expert instructors who would return to their squadrons as surrogate teachers, and most importantly provide realistic air combat maneuvering training against dissimilar aircraft that would prepare pilots for the actual threats they would face over North Vietnam rather than the scripted training scenarios that had dominated fighter instruction throughout the 1950s and early 1960s when strategic nuclear warfare overshadowed conventional dogfighting as the primary focus of American air power. Lieutenant Commander Dan Peterson received orders in December 1968 to establish what would become the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School at Naval Air Station Miramar near San Diego, California, with the informal call sign Top Gun that would eventually become synonymous with fighter excellence throughout the American military and beyond. Peterson started with nothing, no facility beyond a dilapidated trailer that his team cajoled a crane operator into moving next to a hangar in exchange for a case of scotch. No curriculum beyond the lessons painfully learned over North Vietnamese airspace during the previous 3 years, no aircraft beyond what VF-121 the F-4 Phantom II training squadron could occasionally spare from its own demanding schedule, and no budget because the Navy leadership wanted to see if the concept would work before committing serious resources, but what Peterson and his initial cadre of instructors including Lieutenant Commander John Nash, Lieutenant Jim Lang, Lieutenant Jerry Sawitzki, and several other combat veterans did have was an absolute determination to ensure that no more American fighter pilots would die because they lacked the training to survive and win in close-quarters aerial combat against determined adversaries flying capable aircraft. The first Top Gun class graduated in March 1969 after 5 weeks of intensive instruction that emphasized understanding the F-4 Phantom II's performance envelope in excruciating detail, recognizing how to exploit the aircraft's advantages in speed and vertical maneuvering while avoiding the MiG-17 Fresco strengths in low-speed turning and the MiG-21 fishbed strengths in acceleration and nose authority, maintaining disciplined 2 aircraft tactical formations that provided mutual support throughout the engagement, and most importantly developing the aggressive mindset required to press attacks to valid firing solutions rather than breaking off prematurely or firing missiles outside their effective employment parameters. The bombing halt that President Lyndon Johnson ordered in November 1968 continued through the remainder of his administration and into President Richard Nixon's first term, with few missions flown into North Vietnamese airspace as diplomatic efforts in Paris attempted to negotiate an end to American involvement in the war, and this operational pause gave Top Gun the precious time it needed to refine its curriculum, expand its instructor cadre, and train enough graduates to seed every deploying fighter squadron with at least one or two aviators who had experienced the school's demanding syllabus. The effectiveness of this training remained theoretical until March 28, 1970, when Lieutenant Jerry Beaulieu and his radar intercept officer from Fighter Squadron 142 aboard the USS Constellation shot down a MiG-21 fishbed during one of the few aerial engagements that occurred during the bombing pause, and when Top Gun instructors learned that Beaulieu had been a student in the very first class. They closed the school early that day and went to the officers' club to celebrate, because here finally was proof that the training worked and that graduates could apply the lessons learned at Miramar to actual combat situations thousands of miles away over hostile territory. North Vietnam launched a massive conventional invasion of South Vietnam during Easter weekend 1972, sending thousands of troops and hundreds of tanks across the demilitarized zone in a coordinated offensive that threatened to overwhelm South Vietnamese forces and vindicate Hanoi's strategy of outlasting American commitment to the war. And President Nixon responded by ordering Operation Linebacker, a sustained bombing campaign targeting North Vietnamese military infrastructure, petroleum storage, transportation networks, and command facilities with an intensity that dwarfed anything attempted during Rolling Thunder years earlier. The air war that erupted during Linebacker provided the ultimate test of whether Top Gun training and revised tactics could overcome the fundamental problems that had plagued American fighter operations during the 1965 through 1968 Rolling Thunder campaign, and the results exceeded even the most optimistic predictions, with United States Navy fighters achieving a kill ratio that jumped from 2.4 to 1 before Top Gun to 12.5 to 1 during 1972 Linebacker operations, a five-fold improvement that came not from any miracle weapon or revolutionary new aircraft but simply from better training, better understanding of how to employ the same AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles that had been available all along, and better discipline in selecting when to commit to an engagement versus when to refuse combat and wait for more favorable conditions. May 10, 1972 saw the most intense air combat of the entire war when 11 North Vietnamese fighters fell in a single day, including 3 MiG-21 fishbeds destroyed by a flight led by Major Robert Lodge with his Weapons Systems Officer Captain Roger Locker in an F-4D Phantom II from the 432nd Tactical Reconnaissance Wing, though Lodge and Locker's aircraft was subsequently shot down by a Chinese-built Shenyang J-6 using the Soviet Kuban tactics that positioned gun-armed fighters behind the American formations to catch them during the vulnerable moments after missile launches, and while Major Lodge died in the crash, Captain Locker survived to spend 23 days evading capture before being rescued in what became the deepest combat search and rescue mission of the entire war. United States Navy Lieutenant Randy Duke Cunningham and his radar intercept officer Lieutenant Junior Grade William Driscoll became the first American aces of the Vietnam War on May 10, 1972, when they shot down their 5th MiG during intense aerial combat near Hai Phong, achieving ace status aboard their F-4J Phantom II from Fighter Squadron 96 aboard the USS Constellation, and the engagement demonstrated everything that Top Gun training had emphasized about maintaining energy state, using vertical maneuvering to exploit the F-4 Phantom II's superior thrust-to-weight ratio, and pressing attacks aggressively when favorable geometry presented itself rather than accepting stalemate engagements that allowed enemy fighters to escape or force unfavorable merges. Captain Richard S. Ritchie became the first United States Air Force pilot to achieve ace status when he destroyed his 5th MiG-21 on August 28, 1972, flying an F-4D Phantom II from the 432nd Tactical Reconnaissance Wing, equipped with the highly classified APX-80 combat tree system that gave American crews a decisive advantage by interrogating North Vietnamese identification friend or foe transponders and displaying MiG positions on radar scopes even when the enemy aircraft were flying low enough that ground clutter would normally mask their radar returns, effectively allowing combat tree-equipped F-4D Phantoms to detect MiG-17 Frescos and MiG-21 fishbeds at ranges of 50 to 60 nautical miles and set up intercepts that achieved optimal firing geometry for AIM-7 Sparrow employment within the constraints of rules of engagement that still required some form of identification before weapons release. Captain Charles B. de Bellevue, the weapons systems officer who had flown with Captain Ritchie during 4 of his 5 kills, achieved his 6th aerial victory on September 9, 1972 while flying with a different pilot, Captain John Madden Jr., making de Bellevue the highest-scoring American ace of the Vietnam War with 6 confirmed kills, all achieved using a combination of improved tactics, Top Gun-style disciplined employment of AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, and the combat tree system that gave him and his pilot the critical first-look advantage that allowed them to position their F-4D Phantom II for optimal intercept geometry before North Vietnamese pilots even realized American fighters were in their airspace. The 432nd Tactical Reconnaissance Wing operated only about 8 combat tree-equipped F-4D Phantoms at any given time, with a highly classified system requiring special handling and maintenance procedures to prevent compromise to enemy intelligence services, and air crews were briefed extensively on operational security measures including restrictions against calling out detection ranges over the radio that might alert North Vietnamese listeners to the system's unusual capabilities, though on several occasions excited weapons systems officers violated these restrictions and gave away the game by announcing MiG contacts at ranges that far exceeded normal radar performance, leading North Vietnamese commanders to eventually deduce that American fighters possessed some kind of enhanced detection capability and order their pilots to leave identification friend or foe transponders turned off except when absolutely necessary for coordination with their own air defense network. The F-4E Phantom II entered combat operations during 1968 carrying the internal M61A1 Vulcan 20mm cannon that earlier variants had lacked, with the 6-barreled Gatling gun mounted in the redesigned nose alongside a smaller and APQ-120 radar that fit in the reduced space available after accommodating the cannon installation. And while the gun provided a valuable backup weapon for close-in fighting when missiles failed or when geometry didn't favor guided weapon employment, the real revolution came in 1972 when McDonnell Douglas began delivering F-4E Phantoms equipped with leading-edge slats under Project Agile Eagle, a modification that dramatically improved the fighter's maneuverability at high angles of attack by deploying additional lifting surfaces along the wing's leading edge, allowing the F-4E to achieve tighter turning radius and better nose authority during the slow speed scissors and rolling fights where the MiG-17 Fresco had previously held a decisive advantage. The slats came at the cost of reduced maximum speed because the fixed outer slat created additional drag even when the inner slat retracted during high-speed flight, but fighter pilots universally praised the modification because air combat over North Vietnam invariably degenerated into subsonic turning fights where the ability to point the nose at the target and get a valid firing solution mattered far more than theoretical top speed that nobody could use in actual combat, and F-4E Phantom IIs, with Agile Eagle slats, proved competitive with MiG-17 Frescos even in the low-altitude turning fights where the Vietnamese People's Air Force fighter had previously dominated, though pilots still had to respect the MiG-17's superior instantaneous turn rate and avoid trying to win one-circle radius fights at low speeds where the lighter aircraft retained advantages despite the F-4E's improvements. The cumulative effect of Top Gun training, combat tree detection systems, F-4E internal guns, and Agile Eagle slats transformed the air warfare situation over North Vietnam during the 1972 Linebacker campaign, with United States Navy and Air Force fighters achieving kill ratios that vindicated the F-4 Phantom II as a capable air superiority platform when employed correctly by well-trained crews who understood both their aircraft's strengths and limitations plus the enemy's capabilities and preferred tactics. The United States Air Force shot down 107.5 MiGs during the Vietnam War, including 33.5 MiG-17 Frescos, 8 MiG-19s, and 66 MiG-21 Fishbeds, at a cost of 33 F-4 Phantoms lost to enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, achieving an overall exchange ratio of approximately 3.3 to 1 that fell far short of the crushing dominance seen in World War II or Korea but represented a dramatic improvement over the near-parity kill ratios experienced during the early Rolling Thunder years, while United States Navy F-4 Phantom IIs claimed 40 aerial victories at the cost of 7 Phantoms lost to enemy aircraft in air combat, achieving a more favorable 5.7 to 1 exchange ratio that reflected the Navy's earlier adoption of Top Gun training and more aggressive implementation of lessons learned from combat operations. The Vietnamese People's Air Force credited 16 of their pilots with achieving ace status by shooting down 5 or more American aircraft, led by Nguyen Van Cock with 9 confirmed kills including 7 manned aircraft and 2 unmanned reconnaissance drones, followed by Nguyen Doc So with 6 kills and Nguyen Van Bay with 7 kills, though American researchers examining North Vietnamese victory claims against United States loss records have identified significant discrepancies suggesting that propaganda considerations led Hanoi to credit pilots with kills on dates when no American aircraft were actually lost, potentially inflating the ace list beyond what historical evidence can support. The final accounting of AIM-7 Sparrow effectiveness proved sobering for anyone who remembered the optimistic predictions from the early 1960s, with 612 missiles fired during the Vietnam War achieving only 56 kills, a 9.2% kill probability that represented almost exactly 1/10 of the 70% that testing had promised and operational planners had built into their assumptions about how modern air warfare would unfold. The gap between expectation and reality drove comprehensive changes throughout the United States military's approach to air combat training, missile employment doctrine, and fighter design philosophy, with the painful lesson learned that no weapon system, however sophisticated, can compensate for inadequate training, unrealistic employment assumptions, or restrictive rules of engagement that prevent the weapon from being used in the manner for which it was designed. Project Red Baron, the United States Air Force's exhaustive study of air-to-air encounters in Southeast Asia, reconstructed every engagement to identify patterns in altitude, airspeed, geometry, and outcomes, providing the statistical foundation that validated Top Gun's emphasis on disciplined tactical formations, energy management, and aggressive commitment to valid firing solutions, while the Red Baron team's findings also highlighted how Vietnamese people's Air Force ground-controlled intercept tactics exploited predictable American routing and timing to position MiG-17 Frescos and MiG-21 fishbeds for optimal attack geometry despite the North Vietnamese fighters' disadvantages in radar capability, weapons range, and pilot training hours. The MiG-17 Fresco remained a lethal threat throughout the war despite being a subsonic day fighter that the Soviet Union had retired from frontline service before American involvement in Vietnam even began, achieving this longevity through the aircraft's exceptional low-altitude agility combined with North Vietnamese tactical discipline that refused to accept fights on American terms and instead waited patiently for opportunities to exploit the F-4 Phantom II's weaknesses in slow-speed turning, performance, and the persistent reliability problems that plagued AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles throughout Rolling Thunder and the early phases of Linebacker. The MiG-17's wing loading of approximately 268 kilograms per square meter compared favorably against the F-4 Phantom II's 383 kilograms per square meter in early variants, and even higher in later F-4E models with heavier equipment installations, translating directly into tighter turning radius at speeds below 500 knots where the MiG-17 could exploit its superior instantaneous turn rate to gain angles on American fighters that tried to engage in one-circle fights, though the F-4 Phantom II's massive thrust advantage allowed disciplined pilots to disengage vertically using full afterburner whenever the tactical situation deteriorated, climbing away from the engagement faster than the MiG-17 could follow and repositioning for another attack attempt under more favorable conditions. Vietnamese People's Air Force pilots learned to counter this vertical escape tactic by positioning their MiG-17 Frescos close to the ground where American pilots would be reluctant to dive aggressively for fear of impacting terrain, forcing F-4 crews to either commit fully to the low-altitude turning fight where the MiG held advantages or break off the engagement entirely and concede the tactical victory to an enemy flying inferior equipment but employing it with skill and determination. The numbers told the story more clearly than any amount of operational analysis or tactical debate could convey, with the stark reality that pre-war predictions of 70% AIM-7 Sparrow kill probability collapsed to 9.2% in actual combat employment, while the overall United States kill ratio during the 1965 through 1968 Rolling Thunder period barely exceeded 2-to-1 despite massive advantages in aircraft performance, pilot training hours, maintenance support, and numerical strength, forcing a complete rebuilding of how the United States Navy and Air Force approached fighter operations from the squadron level all the way up to theater command, with Top Gun and similar Air Force weapons schools at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada providing the institutional foundation for capturing lessons learned and disseminating them to operational units before they deployed to combat zones. The Linebacker campaign in 1972 demonstrated what properly trained crews could achieve with essentially the same aircraft and weapons that had struggled during Rolling Thunder years earlier, validating the ALT report's conclusion that training and tactical discipline mattered far more than raw technology. Though the addition of combat tree identification systems and F-4E gun and slat modifications certainly contributed to the improved performance by addressing specific capability gaps that North Vietnamese tactics had exploited during the earlier period. United States Navy Fighter Squadron 161 operated from the USS Midway during Linebacker, the same carrier that had launched Commander Lewis Page and Lieutenant Dave Batson on their historic first kill mission 7 years earlier in June 1965. And the squadron's performance during 1972 reflected everything that American naval aviation had learned in the intervening years, with Lieutenant Commander Ronald "Muggs" McEwen and his radar intercept officer Lieutenant Jack Ench achieving multiple MiG kills using disciplined Top Gun tactics that exploited the F-4 Phantom II's strengths while avoiding the MiG-17 Fresco's turning fight advantages through superior energy management and aggressive commitment to valid AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder firing solutions. The last American MiG kill of the Vietnam War occurred on January 12, 1973, when Lieutenant Victor Kowaleski and Lieutenant James Wise from Fighter Squadron 161 shot down a MiG-17 Fresco over the Gulf of Tonkin, closing a circle that had begun with Fighter Squadron 21's pioneering victories in June 1965 and encompassing 8 years of painful lessons about the limits of technology without proper training, the importance of realistic practice against dissimilar aircraft, and the enduring relevance of close-in fighting even in an era when missiles promised beyond visual range dominance. The 5,195 F-4 Phantom IIs produced between 1958 and 1981 served with 11 nations and participated in conflicts from Vietnam through the Arab-Israeli Wars and into the 1991 Gulf War, where improved training and better missiles finally achieved the performance that planners had predicted 3 decades earlier, while the more than 10,000 MiG-17 Frescos built by the Soviet Union, China, and Poland proved that sound aerodynamic design combined with proper tactical employment could remain effective long after newer technology should have rendered the aircraft obsolete. The contrast between the two fighters defined an era of aerial warfare where the promise of long-range missile combat collided with the reality of close-quarters dogfighting, where rules of engagement designed to prevent friendly fire incidents negated the technological advantages that justified billions in development spending, and where the difference between predicted weapon performance and actual combat effectiveness revealed gaps in training, maintenance, and tactical understanding that cost lives and required years of painful adaptation to overcome. The MiG-17 Fresco turned tight at 500 miles per hour using its low wing loading and carefully sculpted swept wings to achieve superior instantaneous turn rates at altitudes below 5,000 feet, while the F-4 Phantom II fired AIM-7 Sparrow missiles from ranges exceeding 10 miles using semi-active radar, homing that promised revolutionary beyond visual range combat. And the collision between these competing concepts forced both sides to adapt, innovate, and ultimately discover that success in aerial warfare depended less on the theoretical performance of individual weapon systems and more on the training, discipline, and tactical judgment of the human beings employing them under the stress of mortal combat, where mistakes meant death and victory required not just courage but also the wisdom to recognize when to engage and when to disengage.